Today we're going to talk about joinery. When doing a project, figuring out what sort of joinery you're going to use to assemble the whole thing is pretty crucial and basically what this whole woodworking thing is about. So if you want to be a better woodworker, it's important to know all the different joints you can make and where and why you would use them. But first, this video would not be possible without this week's amazing sponsor, Remarkable. This is the Remarkable 2 paper tablet, and this is how I'm going to keep this video organized. Let me show you. In today's world, we're connected and reachable at all hours of the day. If you use your computer or phone to design a project, it's very easy to get distracted by pop-up notifications, which are usually not even important. That's why I love Remarkable. It's designed for writing, reading, and sketching only, with no social media, email, or summer concert alerts to distract me from what needs to get done. I've always been a pen and paper girl, but my system was never efficient. I kept pads all over the place, so I was writing everything down. Only problem, I never knew which pad had what information. With the Remarkable paper tablet, everything is organized in one place, and it's a cloud-based note-taking system, so I can access my notes from anywhere. Let's say I left this in my house. No problem, I can access all my notes on my phone. See? Woodworking joints. We have a lot to discuss in this video, but first I want to show you how I use this to design my projects. The paper-like writing on this is so quick and fluid, and I love how you can manipulate notes. See how I can easily resize certain aspects of this quick sketch to make room for an added detail. It's so cool. Another awesome feature, Remarkable can convert your handwritten notes to typed text that you can send in an email right from the device. Old school paper cannot do that. It's a really efficient way to keep your household or business organized. Speaking of my business, I have to sign lots of contracts, which means wasted paper. No more. Using the cloud-based system, I can read, sign, and email contracts using the PDF reader, which is also cool if I'm in my shop and I need to access build plans. It's pretty sweet that I can highlight or make notes as I go. So if you want to keep yourself organized without distractions while not wasting any paper, I highly suggest you try the Remarkable 2 paper tablet. I'm going to leave a link down below so you guys can check it out. Thanks, Remarkable. All right, where were we? First up on the list, we have a butt joint. This is when two pieces of wood are joined by simply butting them together. This is the simplest joint, but it also happens to be the weakest joint. You may have seen this analogy a billion times before, but here it is again. Think about wood grain like a bunch of straws. Pretend these bundles are pieces of wood. If you glued this bundle to this bundle on the edge, the glue will remain on the surface of the straws, so the glue can do its job of sticking these two bundles together. Now, look at the end grain of the straws. When you add glue, it just flows down the straw instead of remaining on the surface, so the glue can't do its job very well if it's no longer there. This right here is the reason why we have all these joinery techniques. Well, this and wood movement, but more on that in a little bit. Anyway, there are a few ways that you could go about making a butt joint stronger. First is by glue sizing, which just means to put a base layer of glue before you actually glue it. Some people mix the glue with water. Personally, I'm lazy and don't bother. I just apply a light coat and wait a couple of minutes for it to get soaked up into the end grain and dry a little bit. Then I do the actual glue up. Now the second layer won't get sucked up into the pores because it's blocked by the first layer, so it could remain on the surface and do its job. Now glue sizing does increase the strength a little bit, but there are definitely times when you'll want to reinforce it even more, and the easiest way to do this is with nails or screws. Nail holes could be filled with wood putty and screws could be covered up with plugs. You can use plugs that match the wood grain or use this as a design feature and create contrast with the plugs. I built this desk for my son over 3 years ago using butt joints that I simply screwed together, then added plugs as a design feature. And despite lots of comments in the YouTube video, it's still as solid as the day that I built it. If you want the reinforcement for a butt joint to be hidden, you have options, but my favorite, simplest method is the dowel joint. Dowel joinery is strong and versatile, and it can be achieved with inexpensive, limited tools. You basically just need a drill, but it's more precise if you also use a dowel jig. And there are a couple of awesome dowel jigs on the market, or you can make one like I did here. I'll link to this video where I made this and I show how to use it. I also have a lot of builds on my channel where dowels were the main method of joinery, like this desk and this nightstand. Another option is biscuits, but I'm personally not a fan, and I know biscuit lovers are going to argue down below. Anyway, another controversial method to reinforce a butt joint, and everyone's favorite, pocket holes. For those not aware, pocket holes are holes drilled at an angle so you can attach two boards with a screw at an angle. The benefit of pocket holes over regular screws is that you're not drilling into end grain with pocket holes. Using the straw analogy again, a screw will hold better when it's locked into the face or edge grain of a piece as opposed to the end grain. Pocket holes are great because they're quick, strong, and easy to do, but they have a bad rap because people think they can use pocket holes for everything and anything, which is just not true. When I was a beginner, I wasn't aware of this, and I made this table where I joined breadboard ends with pocket holes. I got a hard lesson in wood movement on that build, and it was that experience that led me down the road of wanting to learn more about proper methods of joinery. So, what is wood movement? When the seasons change, the amount of moisture in the air changes as well. Where I live, it's dry in the winter and humid in the summer. So in the summer, wood will expand, and in the winter, it will shrink or contract. Think again of the straw analogy. All of these straws will fill with moisture, causing it to expand, and vice versa. But it doesn't just blow up like a balloon the same in all directions, and different cuts of wood will move differently as well. Like a plain sawn board will move more than a quarter sawn board, but I could do a whole separate video on this. The main point regarding wood movement is that the board will typically move the most going across the grain, and the wider the board is, the more it will move. On average, a 6-inch wide board will move about a 32nd, so really anything under 4 inches you just don't need to worry about. You also never need to worry about the length, and since your boards are probably under 4 inches thick, you don't need to worry about the thickness either. Back to pocket holes. If you have this wide board and attach it to the edge of another board using pocket holes, the board will want to expand and contract, but it can't move at the fixed points where the screws are. Instead of moving, it will crack. This is exactly what happened to this tabletop here. So never use pocket holes to attach breadboard ends or to attach a tabletop to an apron, or to attach any wide board to the edge of another board. Me personally, I only use pocket holes for plywood because I know it's a stable material that won't move. Pocket holes are great for building plywood cabinets. All right, moving on to mitered butt joints. Still very simple, but a little more complex because an angle is involved. Usually you will have two pieces cut at 45 degrees to create a square corner, but they could really be cut at any angle to create any shape. This is a very common joint for frames, boxes, casework, a ton of applications, and just like a regular butt joint, there's the problem with exposed end grain. So there are multiple ways to reinforce this joint. But depending on your project, you may not need to reinforce it. I made this box a few years ago as a test to see if mitered boxes need reinforcement, and it didn't explode yet. That being said, if you do want to reinforce miters, there are a few ways. First up, we have the very common and beautiful splines. You can make the slots for the splines so many ways. Tablesaw jig, router table jig, trim router jig, handsaws, and more. The basic idea is to make a slot going across the joint. By doing this, you're exposing the edge grain of the wood on both parts, which will hold the glue better on its surface than the end grain will. Usually these splines are made of a contrasting color, and it becomes a really cool design feature for the project. You can see how the face grain on the splines are now going to come in contact with that exposed edge grain on both pieces in the slots, and that is how it reinforces the joint. Also note the grain direction on the splines. The grain is running across the joint. If you would flip the grain so it was running with the joint, it would defeat the purpose of adding the spline because it could crack along the grain easily. Splines are a very cool way to make a joint stronger and to add some design flair. Check out these brass splines I used on a tee box a few years ago. I thought that was pretty cool. And if you want the reinforcement to be hidden, you can use a hidden spline. Like anything in woodworking, multiple ways to cut this. I've used a jig at the router table to hold the workpiece at an angle to the router bit, or you can tilt your table saw blade and do it that way. Always options. Dowels are also a great way to reinforce the miter, and you can use a dowel jig to easily drill on the ends. Or if you like the exposed dowel look, there are options. You can drill a hole straight on so the dowel is exposed on one side, or you can drill a hole at an angle so the dowel is exposed on both sides. These are great opportunities to add design elements to your project by using contrasting woods. Now let's get into some more technical stuff. Let's talk about dados, grooves, and rabbets. These joints are very simple, but they're also the basis for a lot of other joints we're going to go over, so it's really important to cover them first. A groove is a channel that's cut along the wood grain, and a dado is a channel that's cut across the wood grain. And a rabbet is an open-ended channel that can go along or across the grain, but it's always on the edge of a piece. Since dados, grooves, and rabbets are essentially the same thing, they could all be cut the same way. Table saw by taking multiple passes with a single blade, or a dado blade if you have one. Miter saw with a stop locked in place. Router table or handheld router, where it would help to use some sort of jig like this exact width dado jig. Since the rabbet is on the edge of a workpiece, along with all the other methods, you can also use a special router bit called a rabbeting bit. It has a bearing that runs along the edge as it makes an open-ended groove. All of these joints, though, have an added benefit of alignment. No fussing around when trying to hold the workpiece in the correct position. If cut correctly, the pieces should just lock into their correct position, which is why I love using them. Dados are typically used to build cabinets or bookshelves, and grooves are typically used for holding drawer bottoms or for door panels. Typically, the depth is cut to about 1/3 the thickness of the wood you're using. And these are super strong because the wood is captured on 3 sides, preventing it from moving or wobbling. Let's compare this screwed butt joint to a screwed dado joint. Over time with forces, a screwed butt joint may come loose because there's nothing preventing it from moving up or down. But it's much harder for a joint to come loose in a dado because it's trapped in position. A rabbet is very common for smaller parts, like drawers or for recessing the back of a cabinet. With a rabbet, the wood is not trapped on all sides because it's open-ended, so you will most likely need some extra reinforcement, like using pegs in a rabbeted drawer front or tacking the back of a rabbeted back panel with staples or brads. But like I mentioned, these joints are the basis of a lot of other joints. Check this out. If you flip the rabbet around and lock it in a dado or a groove, it creates a lock rabbet joint. Super satisfying and super strong. This brings us to our next joint, tongue and groove. We know what groove means, a channel cut along the grain of the wood. Now the mating piece, the tongue. This is cut by making 2 rabbets on either face of the wood. The remaining material left in the middle here is called a tongue. Typically, tongue and groove joinery is used to glue up large panels on long pieces. Since the edges of the pieces lock together, you don't have to worry too much about aligning them during the glue up, and they remain pretty flat. Only downside, you'll see the joint on the end, but that could be covered up or left as part of the design. Always options. Also always options when it comes to cutting them. They make these awesome router bit sets where one cuts the tongue and one cuts the groove, but there are a ton of other ways, and I went over in detail how to do these joints on my 6 ways to cover plywood edge banding video if you're interested in learning more. Moving on to lap joints. This is when an area is cut away from both pieces of wood so they lock into each other and become flush. If you look at it, lap joints are basically just dados and rabbets. When cut on the ends of these pieces, it's an open-ended notch, just like a rabbet. If you cut both pieces so you're removing half the thickness in each board, you've created a half lap. If cut in the middle of 2 boards, you're cutting notches going across the grain, so they're just short dados, and this is called a cross lap. The hard part with lap joints is getting your depth of cut just right so it's removing exactly half of the material. This just comes with practice, but a good tip is to use 2 scraps, the same thickness as your workpieces. Cut a little bit on each end, then flip one to see if they become flush on their faces. If they're not, adjust the blade height accordingly. Regarding the width of the cut, half laps on the end are easier because it's open-ended, so you don't need to lock it in tight. You could just plane down any extra material that juts out after assembly. Cross laps, on the other hand, you really need to nail that width or you're going to have unsightly gaps. I use something called a Kerfmaker to get that dimension perfect every time, but there are other tricks as well, like using a shim that's the same size as your table saw blade. Place the mating material between a stop block and the workpiece, then make the cut. Now remove the mating material from between the stop block and replace it with a spacer piece that's the same thickness as your blade. Now make the second cut, then clear out the waste in the middle. You can see how this easily creates a perfect fitting cross lap, and because I know I'm going to get questions about the spacer, here's what would happen if you don't use it. Make the first cut with the mating piece between the stop block, remove mating piece, and don't add spacer. Make second cut and remove the waste in the middle. When you try to join this, you see a huge gap. Well, not huge, it's exactly the size of the table saw blade. So all you have to do is nudge it over a blade curve's distance using the spacer. Easy enough. I think a lap joint was the first real joint that I ever cut, so it's a great intro to joinery because it's so simple, yet adds a ton of strength because of all the increased surface area the glue can actually stick to. Another really easy and strong joint is the bridle joint. This is similar to a lap joint in that the pieces interlock with each other, except instead of having the material, it gets divided into thirds. One piece gets an open-ended slot cut on the end, and the mating piece has essentially 2 rabbets cut on the end. Then they lock into each other. This is stronger than a lap joint because the piece is trapped from moving side to side, and there's so much surface area for glue on both sides that it prevents the joint from being pulled apart. This whole table was built using angled bridle joints for the base over 2 years ago, and it's still as strong as the day I built it, despite my kids climbing all over it. There are a ton of other ways you can use this type of joint. Like if you cut the notches in the center of a workpiece instead of the end, this is called a T-bridle joint. Well, because it makes a T shape. I've also made 3-way bridle joints before, which was super fun. Bridle joints are easy to make because all the cuts can be easily made using saws, so no chisel work is required. You can use a bandsaw, handsaw, or table saw. As long as the setup is right, the cut should fit. And again, that setup just comes with practice. So mill up some extra material that's the same dimensions as the project you're working on to dial in all of your cuts. The bridle joint is very strong, but it's considered a simplified version of a Mortise and Tenon, which is like the gold standard of joinery. The Mortise and Tenon is one of the most common joints out there, and it's also one of the strongest. The joint dates back thousands of years, and you can still find furniture built hundreds of years ago that are still intact using the joint. Just like the bridle joint, the pieces are typically divided into thirds, and the tenon portion is cut just like the bridle joint. But there are usually 2 extra cuts made on the edges, creating a shoulder that goes all the way around the tenon. Creating these shoulders that go all the way around will hide the mating mortise, and the joint will be more seamless. The mortise part of the joint is the hard part because it's closed all the way around on all sides, and you can't just stick a saw in there to cut it out. The traditional way to do this is to chop it out with a chisel, which takes a really long time, and there's also mortising machines that are made just for cutting square mortises. An easier way to do it is to use a router. You can simply use an edge guide or make a jig. After it's cut, you're going to have options. You can square off the rounded corners with a chisel, or you can round off the square corners of the tenon to fit into the rounded slot. Now, if you're looking for a joint that's as strong as the Mortise and Tenon but can be cut in a fraction of the time, then the Domino is for you. So Mortise and Tenon joinery is super strong because the tenon that's cut is trapped inside the mortise, both up and down and side to side. So the domino joint is what's known as a loose tenon or floating tenon. Two mortises are cut and a loose tenon gets glued in place between the two pieces. That loose tenon is now trapped in there, preventing the pieces from moving side to side and up and down. It also has a lot of glue surface on it to keep the joint tight. The domino machine is just a really quick way to cut both of these mortises, and it's awesome, but you can use a regular router and a loose tenon jig to cut them as well. I have a whole video on how I made this loose tenon jig. A lot of these joints are meant to be hidden and they just do all of the work behind the scenes, but there are some joints that add a ton of strength and enhance the beauty of the project as well. Box joints are an example of this. Remember, the whole reason why we cut this joinery is to expose more edge or face grain that glue can adhere to. So with a box joint, you make a bunch of little notches on the ends of two pieces that will lock into each other by the edge grain. There are a ton of box joint jig tutorials out there, and they're so easy to cut because they're just a bunch of straight cuts. You can cut them at the router table or the table saw really quickly and easily. I have a video on a really quick and simple box joint or finger joint jig that you can use on the table saw. Again, nailing the fit on box joints just comes down to practice and testing your cuts on scrap. I never do my first cuts on my actual work pieces. I always mill up extra for dialing in the fit of joinery like this. Box joints are great for while building boxes, whether that's casework or draw boxes, and the added glue surface area is great. But if you want to go the extra mile and cut joinery for draws or casework that will be even stronger, you can cut a dovetail joint. The box joint interlocks with straight cuts, so there's no mechanical strength inherent in this joint. Without glue, you can easily pull it apart in both directions. The dovetail joint, on the other hand, interlocks with wedges. So once assembled, even without glue, it's impossible to pull this piece out because the wedges cut on the joint. Pretty cool. That's why dovetails are so common on draw fronts. You're constantly pulling a draw open and closed, so the mechanical strength that you get from the tails being wedged into the pins will keep your draw together for many, many years to come. I mentioned tails and pins. This confused me when I first started, and I didn't know which one was which, but there's an easy trick if you're looking at the faces of the boards. These are the tails because there's an angled cut which is creating the dovetail shape. These are the pins because all you can see is a straight square cut. I'm not an expert on dovetail joinery, so I don't really have any tips or tricks on how to cut them. But there is one type of dovetail that I do love to incorporate into my projects, and that's the sliding dovetail. I love making this joint because all you need is a dovetail router bit, and I use it anytime I want to add mechanical strength to a project. Think of it like a dado on steroids. It locks into place due to the angled cuts, and you don't even need glue. I used a stop sliding dovetail on the base of this record player stand I built, and it's really so simple. After removing the bulk of the waste for the slot, you can use a dovetail bit to cut the angled sides. This could also be done at the table saw with the blade tilted if it's a through cut. Anyway, to cut the mating dovetail piece, you just have to keep taking multiple passes by pushing the router table fence slightly away from the bit with each pass until it fits in the slot. I also recently used it to test out these removable fence options for router jigs. I just think sliding dovetails are really cool. So I know this video is super lengthy, but I feel like this just scratches the surface of what's possible with joinery. This is really just the basics, and everything else builds upon all of this. Once you understand the why, figuring out which method to use for your projects will just become second nature. And I hope that a big lesson here was that there really is no right answer. There are always options for different situations, and you should do whatever you're capable of doing using the tools that you have. I've built furniture using Mortise and Tenon joints, and I've built furniture using plugged up screws. Both are fine. One may last longer than the other, but for the purpose of the desk that I built for my son, screws were just the amount of effort I was willing to put into it, knowing full well he was going to color all over it eventually. I have built drawers using dovetails and drawers using pocket holes. Each situation is just different. The answer is never universal. It depends what the project is, how it's going to be used, what tools you have, and how much time you're willing to put into it. That answer will vary from person to person and project to project. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, you do you and don't let the joinery snobs get to you. On that note, huge thank you to this week's sponsors, Remarkable and WOODCRAFT. Without them, these videos would not be possible. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. My job is so weird.